Welcome to the Field Notes podcast, presented by Seaworthy Functional Medicine. Seaworthy exists to help you overcome your complex health challenges, so you can be fully vital. Now, here's your host, Heather Moon.
What if healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, but about remembering what's whole? In functional medicine, we look for root causes, patterns, and physiology. But underneath the labs, the protocols, and the plans, there's a human being carrying stories, beliefs, losses, hopes, and questions. These don't all fit neatly into the chart. Today, we're exploring the space where functional medicine and spirituality meet, not as belief systems, but as ways of seeing the person in front of us. How meaning shapes biology, how connection influences healing, and what becomes possible when we treat the whole person, not just the diagnosis. I'm so thankful to be joined today by my guest, Frank Alioto. He's a chaplain at Central Peninsula Hospital, among other roles, which I'll allow him to elaborate on. Frank's work reminds us that healing isn't only physical, it's emotional, spiritual, and deeply human. He brings presence into moments of uncertainty, loss, and transition, and helps people find meaning even when answers are hard to come by. Frank, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yay! I kind of felt like there was somebody else behind me that should come in, like the boxer would come in. I'm like, but she's talking about me, and so yay! These are fun things that I get to be a part of.
You want me to tee up Eye of the Tiger?
Yes, that would be awesome. Countless hours in front of the mirror as a kid singing that song.
Well, Frank, we really just like to start with a short origin story, kind of the superhero origin story, where you came from and where you got to be where you are. And I would like to hear about the other roles that you serve as. And so please just share with us about who you are and how you got to be here.
Yes. Well, I definitely see my role as a chaplain as not just, a job, working with spiritual care, but also as a calling. And I guess that calling goes way back, right? As a little kid, I grew up in San Francisco Bay Area. Was born in San Francisco and lived in Marin County for just a little bit. But I remember the house I grew up in, weekly, these people would come by and I was like, dude, that's the job. That is the job. One day a week. And it was the garbage man. And I was like enamored, I'd run to the window and I'm sure it wasn't every week, but I just remember kind of looking out like, that's the gig, you work then and then you're done, and of course I didn't recognize that they'd go to every house and they had daily tasks. And so that was kind of like, yeah, my job. And then I thought as a kid, oh, it'd be fun to be a fireman. It's like those are people that do all these rescues and get to care for people and, bravery and all this stuff. And as I got older, I had the great privilege of being part of Boy Scouts, which was my love for the outdoors and, just seeing things. My parents, we were grounded in a church and a relationship with God experience. And so that was also a really fun part. But as part of Boy Scouts, my parents, wouldn't always let me go sleep over people's houses. And so they're like, hey, do you want to join Boy Scouts? And it was part of our church. And I was like, oh, yeah, that'd be cool. And I'd get out into the woods. And so we had a troop that was really focused on getting out in the woods and in God's creation. And kind of ironically, I was the kid that would go to church all the time. So in our Boy Scout troop, they were like, hey, we need a chaplain. And I was like, well, what's that? And basically it was, an opportunity to share the spiritual aspects of life. And usually our Boy Scout trips were Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. So I would often put together a little church service for my peers and, just kind of be a resource for, for others. And with that, it kind of was like, I never thought it'd be a calling, but as life went on and went to college and grew into different opportunities, I was helping out, volunteering at our church in Pleasant Hill, California, and God opened up the door after my education finished up at Cal Berkeley to work full-time at a church. And I worked with youth. I worked in our like kind of missions, was part of our Sunday experience. And I never really saw chaplaincy as kind of a full time because I was working as a pastor. Um, but upon moving up to Alaska, where we came up here to plant a church, um, God opened up a door for me to be involved with the fire department as a chaplain. And then eventually, here at the hospital, there was a role, and we were trying to make ends meet. And so I started part time as a chaplain here at Central Peninsula Hospital, and then it opened up full time. And so, I see like God opening up all these different doors and venues. And, who would have thought that as a chaplain, in Boy Scouts, that it would open up to a role. And I kind of laugh about the part of being a garbage man and also a part of, wanting to be in the fire department, but I also was pursuing for a while healthcare, and it kind of seemed like all these things came together, and each aspects of those, in the sense of just showing up to take out the garbage, right? Just doing daily tasks are things that you just come alongside to help out people in these different venues. And it's not always bravery, it's sometimes coming alongside people. So all those roles have kind of opened up how do we serve people best. And I kind of see even just the general aspects of life opening up for chaplaincy.
That is so amazing and so funny. Thank you so much. From garbage man to superhero to chaplain. I think you're all of those in one.
Yes, and
Yeah.
all respected roles, I see those in high regard. So
Well, as a chaplain, I'm sure there's some garbage taking out that you do need to do, right?
the heavy lifting, the hold your nose, the hey, I'm showing up,
Yeah.
That's a lot of what chaplaincy is too.
Yeah. Well, so speaking of showing up, one of the things that I wanted to ask you is when you walk into a patient's room or when you sit down with someone, whether that be a patient or a staff member or someone at the fire department or a family, what do you notice in yourself first before the encounter really even begins?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, my if I'm looking back at my younger self would be like, okay, what do I need to say? What's my list? What are the things that I can bring to the situation? And I think the longer I've been in chaplaincy and even serving as a pastor and just even as a friend, showing up, seeing what God's doing, and then trying to be a part of it. Like even if it's walking into a patient's room, I could think, oh, I know what to do, but how do I just be still? And how do I become part of the process? Some of my friends would say, how do you be part of the divine? And I would say, I just simplify it. God, what are you doing? Let me be quiet. Let me sense that. And so walking in, where is this person at? I'm very grounded in my faith, and that's a lifelong journey. And I have some very, I don't know, some people would say exclusive beliefs, but I really feel like God is very inclusive. And how do I just come alongside people? Um, as chaplains, often a question when somebody checks into a hospital, they'll ask, what is your religious preference? And so I have this, at least what they said when they walked in. And I even remember being asked that question. And the first time I was asked, I'm like, am I going to die? What's going on? This got serious really quick. I'm just coming into this, and so people, there's sometimes an understanding that, maybe our beliefs align, or maybe that's what they said when they came in the first time, or, maybe their opposites are completely different than me. And my goal isn't to change people. I believe God does that, right? And so I just come alongside, offer presence, offer meaning, walking with, asking the hard questions, listening to people, and really trying to see what God's doing and how could I complement that process.
That's so wonderful. And I think it's so needed when there's all the machinery and all the uncertainty around. I think it's really important. Are you there primarily at the hospital there? Are you primarily there to serve patients or to staff or families or everyone?
Yeah, initially, when I first started working here almost 12 years ago, um, kind of my hit list was to focus on our patients. And I really found that, it took a while to, not just win the right to be heard, but to relationally be trusted
Mhm.
by my peers. And some I knew, but, I have some long-standing friendships with people within the organization, and really to know, because sometimes people, when they hear spiritual care, they're kind of like, what is that? And our hospital is grounded in a plain tree philosophy of care, which connects people to body, mind, and spirit. And it's not the fluff of the organization. It's kind of like our DNA, and it's hard to keep that together. I knew when I moved here about 17 years ago, in a smaller community, it was kind of like, when I came to the hospital, and it's like, oh, these are just our good small town values. We want to take care of people. We know that this person that we're going to serve may be in a hospital bed or maybe on the operating table, but I'm going to see them at our grocery store. I'm going to run into them when I'm fishing out in the trails. And so, these are our people, and how do we keep these values alive? And spiritual care is not just a kind of an add-on. I mean, I feel like, in our organization, it's the most important part. And I try to live that out. And, people may initially come to put a Band-Aid on or have some sort of care, but we know that there's deeper questions that are part of the healing process and even who we are as humans.
Wow, yeah, that's really amazing. It's definitely in Homer and definitely in Alaska. It is a small world, and you're so right to talk about the fact that not only are we going to see them in the place that we work, but we're also going to see them in the community, and our kids are going to play basketball with them and things like that. And so we're all connected. Um, if 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 you were to share with a medical provider your thought about when and how to include the chaplain in a patient's care, what would your recommendation be?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, that we're very complex creatures, right? I mean, spirituality is one aspect. How do we as humans do life together relationally? We're emotional, we're intellectual, um, we're physical. And so, you know, my intent is, you know, that people would get cared for physically and even spiritually. Those are the deep needs. As a follower of Jesus, when Jesus went to speak to people when he was on earth 2,000 years ago, often the physical aspects were sometimes opportunities to not only show who he was, as I believe he is God and fully man, but he would address those issues. If it was hunger, if it was some sort of healing, and those were not just to show his power, but also to show that, that is an important part. And so initially, people may come to the hospital or receive care because there's a physical ailment. But, when you really get to it, sometimes those questions aren't so much like, hey, am I going to die? Because most people, even if they don't want to admit it, know that they will die at some point. But what is going on with me spiritually? Uh,
Mhm.
and so the questions that doctors address often deal with the physical, but I can come alongside and complement. I remember one interaction I had with a hospitalist here years ago, and we were doing rounding, visiting patients with a team of us. And at one point, we were talking about a patient, and he looked at me and was like, I feel like you're undoing what I'm doing. And, he was kind of challenging, and that's his personality. And I was like, oh, I'm here to support the patient. And this is where they are. They're ready to go. They've taken care of things relationally with family. Spiritually, they're in tune with their relationship with God. And they're done. And here's this doctor. I can fix. I can do this.
Mhm.
And, for many doctors, that's why they get into it, because they want to care for people and they physically want to do it. And yeah, you may be able to extend people's life, but we all know that, just being there without being able to connect with people or have meaning, it's not always the most important thing, just to physically live on this earth longer, which we want to support and we want to care for people. But sometimes people are like, I'm done. I'm
Mhm.
good. The Apostle Paul in the Bible said, I finished the race marked out for me. And so there's a joyful thing. And, a lot of doctors see that too, just knowing that they can only do so much. They are not God. Um, so I really see us complementing each other and being a part of that um, process of meaning and hope in life.
Yeah. Wow. That's really beautiful. How do you offer hope, or what is your approach as far as supporting patients, providers, families, the people that you love when there are unknowns and the answers are uncertain, or there's kind of a bleak outlook?
Yeah. I think often it's, kind of my approach when I connect with patients, if it's, like physically here in the hospital, even with my peers that I do life with, or maybe out in the community as a chaplain or as a pastor, um, kind of asking those tough questions, what is important to you? And one of my mentors, challenged me to ask that question, not just going hard saying spiritually, what's going on, because often people are like, well, I don't go to church. And I'm like, that's not the question, asking people, what is the most important thing for you today?
Mhm.
And when you let people answer that, sometimes it's like, we could think, I don't want to be in pain. But often it's, like, hey, is my pet okay?
Mhm.
You think about if you had some sort of uh, physical ailment which brought you in by ambulance to the hospital and you left your pet and maybe you lived alone, what's happening to them? And I don't want to say they don't care about the physical aspects, but they're all, are my loved ones okay? Is my pet okay? And so really kind of getting to the core of what is most important to them and then helping them navigate maybe to have that need met. Hey, your pet's okay. Now what do we need to do? And really recognizing and supporting, our doctors too and our healthcare givers, with saying, hey, these are the things that they're trying to move to, and helping you have health and healing. But, kind of digging in, what is the core of that, and um, often sometimes, our own not taking care of ourselves gets us into a hospital. And I know you're about even like, what is the preventative care, not just let's throw pills at people, right? But how could we prevent this from happening, or how can we have um, guidelines that as somebody in my mid 50s, a lot of my friends are in their mid 50s as well, and so they're recognizing too that a lot of the things they did to get through life, whether it's coping, whether it's behaviors or addictions, they recognize that those they can't live in the same way, and we kind of start to question, what am I living for? And how can I ask these deep questions, and often sometimes people will reflect back to the spiritual aspects of life. And, maybe that was a relationship with God, or maybe that was a practice that helped them grow, or maybe that was even understanding, how do I live in grace instead of just living in duty or behavior, or like, does God love me, and why is this happening to me? And maybe even
Mhm.
asking those deep spiritual questions, why does suffering happen, and what's going on with me? So getting to those deep questions, and often I will, ask them and listen to them talk about, what is spiritually important and what things do they need to take care of. So
Yeah.
yeah, jumping into those deep questions.
Wow. Yeah. And that's wonderful. Speaking of those deep questions, if you do this, how do you do this? How is there a way that you reframe, why is this happening to me? And do you reframe it as to how can I live as well as I can in this?
Yeah, so with, like even human suffering, sometimes, like people ask, why is this happening to me? And like I can give them a theological answer, but the deeper aspect is why are they asking this? Because it's not even always just working with the patient, but it's working with the family. Like why did this happen to somebody? Or is God punishing me? And so, like, why are we asking those questions? And when people reveal the why of that, why they are asking those questions, usually it gets to the hard issues of realizing, too, as humans, we're not in control. We'd like to be God, right? I mean, it's kind of what gotten us into a lot of the mess, but we're not. And recognizing that even though we live in a broken world, in my faith belief system too, that there's a God who comes alongside and walks with us and doesn't like Santa Claus just take it all away, but promises to be there and to give us choice and allows us to rely on him and his promises. And even like this morning, I was reading a scripture that talked about God has us in his grip and he won't let us go. And so to be able to extend some of that hope and some of that faith that I have, or even to allow people to live into that faith that they have in their beliefs. And really, for some of them, we may see things in a similar worldview, but for some people too, it's really saying, hey, is that working for you? And so asking those deep questions and to see how um, even through this pain that is their faith system or their spiritual belief, because I believe we're all spiritual, really going to help them walk through this and just walking with them, not kind of shoving anything down their throat, but how can they grow through this and to ask those questions. And so, a lot of us have those deep questions, at death, like even three questions I try to help people with, at least communicate to their loved ones, to say, I love you, to their loved ones, to say, do you forgive me? Uh, and say to them too, I forgive you. And often, when we're at the physical pain, those deep core questions come up for most of us as humans, what's important to me.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. So that's really deep and very meaningful and moving. And it leads me to ask, how do you carry the weight of what you carry as your job, and how do you bring that home, and what does that look like for you?
Yeah, and when I reflect being a chaplain as a young kid, I remember I was once in Yosemite doing a church service, and I had the view, right? We were just we had climbed up Half Dome, I guess the night before, and the day before, and then we were coming down and we were doing this church service right over this waterfall, and I'm looking into Yosemite Valley, and the scouts were looking at me, right? And I was kind of like, they were focused on, the scripture I was sharing for the day or the thought or the prayer. We called it Scout Zone. And I'm looking out at God's creation. I'm just like, wow, I get the view of the divine, the holy. And, it's, what has made Alaska so meaningful for our family as my kids grew up here and we live here. Um, it's just that in God's creation, we get to really participate with his presence. And it's like if we fail as human beings to give God glory, the rocks and the trees, and I don't think I haven't met anybody who is reflected on creation and just like, this is a divine plan. And I know some people believe it just happened, but for it to be a divine plan. And so for me to participate with God and to be part of that plan, and not that I'm God or I do these things, I'm his hands and feet. So really to hold things loosely and to know that, God has equipped me, he's given me gifts. Um, Daily I can bring those gifts, and it's not just a listening ear or maybe some advice or something that God's allowed me to remember, but to bring people into that presence of God and to know that it's not all about me. And so I hold it loosely. I'd like to think that I have some aspect of it, and I do, but I think it's God working through me. And so realizing that I can't be there for everyone, I can't be there at every death or walk people through the hardest times. Sometimes, I like, oh, I should go visit this patient. And I'm like, I need to get home. And then I'll come in the next morning and realize that that person has passed away. And, not to think, oh, I should have done this or I could have done this. At the same time, I realize too, my time's short with people. And so I need to be very intentional and to be listening. And so, you know, coming from a place of understanding, the words of Jesus, who said, I've come to give life overflowing. I kind of look at my life as that way. If I'm filled up with the things of Jesus, then I can overflow that to others. And I need to understand too that, I need to live in out of that overflow. And if I'm running on empty, I can't do that. I'm not God. I can't be everywhere all the time. Even when people ask for that, I'm sorry, I can't be there. I'm here or there. So recognizing how do I do self-care and, that whole um, opportunity to build resilience. So I was just with a group this morning, early morning. We had an event at our hospital. We weren't trying to care for people and recognizing too that, when bad things happen, it affects us and we want to be human still. We don't want to just say, okay, I'm going to stuff that away and just keep going, and so recognizing that as humans, what can we do to take care of ourselves physically, emotionally, relationally? And, when I drive home and I take off that badge or, take off my jacket, I leave those things at work. Even if I'm on call and I have to come back to the hospital or I have to go out in our community or I answer a question from somebody in our church or, to recognize that I'm part of it and I need to take care of myself and recognizing that, I need to take care of the spiritual practices that help build me up. And so encourage people to do that and find the list of things that we can do to keep growing and to give out of that overflow.
Wonderful. It's so, I feel like it's so pertinent and ties so well into functional medicine, but into wellness in general. Functional medicine was never intended to be separate from conventional medicine or Western medicine. It was intended to partner with it or even to be what we want medicine to look like. So I definitely cannot understate the importance of self-care. Are there places or things or times where you feel like spiritual unwellness shows up physically?
Yeah. You see that, I guess when I first started working at the hospital, there were two patients that kind of impacted me. One was somebody who was battling with addiction and, not having that as a struggle. I mean, at least with chemicals or that type of thing in my life. I watched this person, and they came in, kind of retuned them, and then they went back out, and then they came back again. And this person was kind of like what I would say the lowest of lows, where they were disease and infection was ravaging their body. And as they progressed, I would meet this person daily. And one of the cool parts was, seeing this person then in our community and how they continue to do well. And in fact, even working in healthcare, caring for people where they were years later, was kind of this testimony of just wellness. Um, and so looking at how can that person grow and even take the worst part of their life, what I would see, and use it for good. And now they're caring for others. And so you see that, like where addiction is kind of, I don't want to say a no-brainer of saying, oh, that's bad for you. When you stop doing that, you'll be doing so much better. And yes, but even saying, okay, in that worst place, in my pain, I'm now investing others. I can not only identify, I mean, sometimes people will see me and say, well, you've never been addicted to this, so you don't know. And you're right, I don't know, right? But, I know that when a diabetic patient comes in there and they haven't been taking care of themselves and they lost a toe, the next time it may be a foot or it may be a leg, and how hard that is for people to go through. And, Sometimes it's preventable, sometimes it's not. I'm not giving any foreknowledge in that. But knowing too that, if we're not taking care of ourselves, eventually the things are going to break down. I was sharing at a care facility that we have close by, and I had just turned 50, and this was a bunch of years ago. And I remember telling these residents, many of them were much older than me, some weren't, but I was like, "Oh, I'm turning 50 this week," and stuff like that. And one of the residents was like, 50, you know, that's when the warning lights go on, and it's not always at a certain age. Some of us, have illnesses that project, earlier, or maybe it's a disease and something we have to live with. And some of it can be preventable and we can go from there. But to know that, when we treat an illness, sometimes it can be this deep part within us. We could say addiction. That's a no-brainer, right? Maybe, hey, you need to eat better, and teaching people how to take care. And my wife has been very encouraging in that journey. And my parents, oh man, my parents were like, they have hippie tendencies, right? And growing up in Marin and San Francisco in the 60s and 70s. And so my dad was always taking care of stuff physically, and it's like, I think he was like when protein powder came out, he was probably the first one on board. And so I remember having protein shakes as a young kid and being like, oh, this is cool. And we would eat well and whatever the trend was, he would do, and we'd see benefits. And so I'm all for that, and I know helping encourage people, and some of it's just education, some of it's just support, some of it's saying, even in my life, I need to do this different, and then sometimes even to the spiritual parts, which I know was maybe part of your question, sometimes like even worrying. I mean, we know what worrying will do. I was reading a scripture yesterday, like where it said, who by worrying can add even another day to your life? So how do we manage worry? How do we not let that build up to where we're getting ulcers, or, our blood pressure's way up? And so there's things that we can address on a spiritual side that can feed into good ways of living. If it's learning how to breathe, it's learning how to de-escalate a situation, if it's learning how to respond in love instead of in anger. Those are all part of health and wellness. But some can be you could speak to it better than I can, but some could be like pinpointed back there. But sometimes even it's a spiritual condition too, which can just wreak havoc on the rest of your body and destroy us.
Yeah. Yeah, we're tied together. And I think a lot of times people, I make the mistake of thinking that my spirituality is separate from my physical being, and it really isn't. And if all things aren't well, then it starts to take a toll, and then you start to see it physically. And I think a person's spirit changes as well if they're not spiritually well. I think that is obvious in their spirit also.
Hey, can I just brag about you? I know, because this is not about you right now, but it was fun. For the audience, I've known Heather for a bunch of years, and there's a race, and I don't call it a race because you're the racer, I'm the participant, Lost Lake race. And we knew that you were on this run, and Suzanne and I I think we were walking at that time, running. I don't know. We were just together. We're like, we just finished the race, right? And Heather's all about, I'm going to do my best. And here you are trudging along down this muddy trail, and you were behind us. And Suzanne's like, oh, that's Heather. And she's like, calls out, Heather. And you're cruising along on the downhill portion, and you stop and you see us, and you just kind of turn around in just your whole persona, and you give us these big hugs. And we talk for a second, and then you keep running. And it's like, how do we, like, that's a great metaphor for life. How do you slow down and do what's important, even if it's just giving a hug? And I remember that hug, and it's like who you are, and how do we wrap ourselves around people or even ideas, and just savor the moment and do what's important and connect with those that not only we care about, but just living in that moment. And I think, the whole part of well-being and functional medicine is living into those moments of doing what's important at that time, because it is the most important thing.
Yeah, I remember those hugs too. Those were really sweet. And I also remember you telling me your mom's proud of you.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
That was a really nice time. And getting to the finish was important, but giving you guys a hug, that was definitely more important. And it was better for me physically and spiritually too than getting to the finish line faster. I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, and that's kind of, isn't that what wholeness and health is all about? It's just like, I know I should be doing this, but this is the most important thing, and I'm going to live in this moment to take care of myself, whether it's physically, intellectually, emotionally, spiritually, relationally, and stopping. And in a society where we're so like driven, it's like if we don't do that, we're going to be lost. I had a great experience, and I'll just kind of share a brief part of it. I went to Nepal just to trek with one of my pastor buddies, my best friend, and some random Buddhist person that he met on a trail in Colorado years ago. And the whole part of the trip was like, I need to be in shape. I need to do this right. We're going to this really treacherous, the three highest mountain peaks, not peaks, three highest mountain passes that we were going to cover. And basically, our Sherpa, who was kind of a friend of a friend there, said, we're going to just learn how to walk. Like, I know how to walk. He's like, and I was all walking fast. I was training on our local hills. I had my backpack. Just learn how to walk. And he would stop us slow. And we would just slowly walk. And it was so hard. And one day he let me lead. And I was like, no, I just want to walk at my pace. And he's like, you must learn the new pace. And he wasn't some guru on a mountain, even though it was beautiful like that. But he's just slow. And so kind of what I took away from the trip too is like, how do we slow down? I don't want to say listen to your body because that sounds so poetic, but just do things differently to care for yourself in whatever season you are in life, and how important that is.
Yeah, wow. Thanks for sharing that experience. I can envision it now, and it's actually really nice to think about how important it is just to walk sometimes, maybe all the time, when we're constantly fighting to do things right and do things the very best way and constantly achieve and constantly improve and do our best. I mean, I think as humans, that's our drive, and that's what's helped us continue from when we first arrived at Earth or came into Earth or were created. But it is nice just to think about, at times all you have to do is just walk.
Yeah, yeah, it's fun stuff.
So if presence were to be considered an intervention, how do you think medical care would change? How would it look different?
Yeah, I think, and just my observations, because like I said, I compliment the doctors, and often our doctors, like maybe I'm meeting with a patient and they'll come in and they'll be like, hey, I'm not the most important person in the room. Frank, why don't you continue? And they don't say that, but they do that. I'm like, hey, no, come in. We were just talking about you. And so the presence of walking with people, I mean, professionally, that we would say, that's why we pay the big hospital bills, right? So that I can get the expert to tell me. And so a doctor coming alongside, with good bedside manners, or a doctor that we visit in an office is, someone who not only makes times, but they connect. We have a book, and it's kind of funny, we give it out, and it's called Compassionomics.
Mhm.
See it,
Oh,
and I joke with our new employees that, like, you guys could borrow it from us, but we give this to all our doctors, and so, it's kind of like, what is it called? The revolutionary scientific evidence that caring makes a difference. Now I could say, duh, I just, the way that God's wired me is like, it's like, if we're not caring, we don't show love, then we're not even reflecting the character of God. But someone else had to write another book to scientifically prove it. And there's some great things in there that not only talk about how we do that, but there's ways that we can learn how to be more compassionate. But if it's just leaning into somebody in a conversation, if it's listening, if it's reflecting back what you hear others saying, the I almost messed up, but I didn't mess up. I would say the ministry of presence is something everybody can do. It's like coming alongside people in their darkest hour or in their concerns or in the deepest questions that we have. Um, as a chaplain, I'm usually in often some of my time is emergency situations. And, you'd like to think that, I go there and say, okay, this is what we got to do. And here's my booklet. And these are the questions we have to ask. And often it's just standing with people. We call that the ministry of presence. And doctors do it, nurses do it. And even when they intentionally have to ask questions, um, I'll stand with somebody maybe for 3 hours and people will be like, thank you for everything you did. And I'll walk away saying, well, I just sat here and prayed and sometimes was distracted. But, being there in solidarity, just being a presence, a rock, so to speak, is that showing up, and listening to them and reflecting back and just being with people. And so, I think good healthcare and even, functional medicine is that, just listening, right? Listening to people, as a caregiver, even we say, listen to your body. What is your body saying to you? And it's not like this audible voice, but, like, oh, I'm in pain. Well, where's that pain coming from? And we get to the core of it. And sometimes it is, those spiritual questions, and I think God allows us to go through pain and, he's not the giver of pain, right? But he allows it to happen and promises to walk with us and be there. And I mean, most of us who have been through life know that the hardest parts of life, physical, emotionally, relationally, even intellectually or spiritually, are the times that we got to see who we are and learn about ourselves and not just, say, well, that really sucked and just kind of put it in that dark part of our life, but to say, that's when I learned the most about myself. And that's when I relied on these people or these practices or this relationship, or this divine relationship with God. And I was like, man, that's what gives me the ability to get through the hard stuff in life. So yeah, presence is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And those hard times actually teach us what we're capable of as well.
Yeah.
And often that we're not alone. You mentioned illness and things showing up in the body. Would you see illness as something that's a messenger from our bodies or as something to fight or something else?
Yeah, it's kind of the combo. In the Bible, Paul, who wrote a lot of the New Testament as God inspired him, um, he struggled with this. Scripturally, it says a thorn in his side. And theologians for centuries have debated, what is it? Is it a mental illness? And of course, whatever, weird stuff or whatever hard stuff people going through is kind of like, well, I think it was this, or I think it was that, or I think it was a person, or I think, and the reality is scripture doesn't describe what it was, but Paul says, like, God, you love me. Why don't you take this away from me? And he kind of gets to this point, maybe it's the dark night of the soul where he's gone through this season of hardship. It's like, you've allowed this to be present with me, and I'm going to use this so that I'm dependent on you, God. And I was joking about this with one of my friends who had this tragic accident of he was he was allowing it was kind of like a dry land dog sledding experience, where he ended up breaking his leg and he had compartment syndrome, which is, like the end all that's really, the worst of the worst, right? In his leg. And so part of his leg died and so he walks with a limp now. And we used to run all the time together and very capable. And we were, I would say we were laughing about it because he embraces life, right? And he's saying, yeah, somebody told me, and like, never or don't trust anybody who doesn't have a limp, and for him, it's a physical limp, right? But for many of us, we have hard stuff about us that we've been through, and if you have a spiritual support system where that God's walking you with that limp, then that's where faith grows. And it's not a blind faith, it's a faith to say, hey, God took me through this. He can walk with me through anything. In fact, I'm doing a funeral today for a patient I just met who was given this diagnosis that they would die, and it was soon, and they were totally with it, right? And I walked into the room with a family member and the patient, and there was this resolve on this person's face, and just saying, man, I know who I am. I have a relationship with God. And they had this just this foundation of security through the toughest part, which we would say, death, and this resolve, and was like, I know that my God, who has walked with me through life, will carry me in this time. And here I am as a chaplain, like, going in there to try to encourage them. And I'm like, yes, that is what I believe. And if I were in their shoes, could I say the same thing? And I'd like to say yes until I face it. I'm sure I'll have that question, and I believe I will. And so illness and walking with illness is, even though something we'd love to eradicate, right? Because that's why we go to doctors. But also to know that sometimes it can be a significant part of growth, and even part of our grand story in our existence and in life. And so, yes, we want to eradicate it. Yes, we want to live with it. Yes, we want to do healthy things to get it out of the way, right? But even knowing that if this is something we have to live with, how can we live with this limp, and how can we use it to even reflect our Creator in a divine way?
Wow, that's amazing. That's wonderful. Well, I really appreciate you. You are such a blessing to our community and to patients and to the firefighters and the staff at the hospital. Where can people find you? Do you have, they could find you at Central Peninsula? How do people get in touch with you?
Yeah, I mean, we live here in Kenai, and you can find me here at the hospital. Hopefully find me on a trail out there, right? Opportunity. I also am a pastor. We are part of a house church, which I know always sounds kind of like, woo, but we're just like, hey, we're trying to do life together. We're trying to be known. We're trying to walk together in how we can do life and follow Jesus in meaningful ways that not only reflect God's glory, but make him attractive to all. That's hard in a world that's so polarized, and we want to, do you align with me? Do you not align with me? What do you believe? What do you not believe? And we love to push that narrative, but how can we be people of peace, and how can we share light in a dark world? And that's my job.
Yeah. Wow. Well, thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks for joining us for the Seaworthy podcast. Seaworthy exists to help people overcome their health challenges and be fully vital. If you think we've earned it, please consider giving this podcast a like, subscribing, and giving us a 5-star rating on the platform of your choice. Thanks.